Dr. Richard Brown.
Welcome to Your History and Health Comes First. Viruses versus humans, part one. That's what I'm going to talk about today. You know, we've been fighting this virus now for going on 3 years. 3 years now. Some people thought it was going to be temporary. And at least many of us have been fighting for it. There's been a lot of people fighting against it, a lot of people ignoring it. A lot of people who've been persecuting others for fighting against the virus, including fighting against and persecuting those who are the most knowledgeable about viruses and the disease, like Dr. Fauci. But, you know, going into the third year now, we've got to really focus. It is not over. It's not time to give up. I mean, what is the current status of the battle? And it is a battle. And what does the future look like? So today on my topic of virus versus humans, I'm going to kind of look back and see where viruses came from and look at some history and talk a bit about those who have been fighting against this disease for centuries. So during my research, I found an article by Dr. Ananya Mandel, and she discussed the past history and origins of the battle against viruses. So she reports that viruses have existed as long as life has been on Earth. My guess is they were here before people inhabited the Earth. They're tiny, they're microscopic. We can't see them without a microscope. And so they're here. We don't know where they are, but we know they're here. And we have to assume that these viruses are everywhere. And as I talk a bit about some of this history, hopefully you will gain an understanding and appreciation for how many microorganisms are out there that we are living with and that we must fight against. So early references to viruses include the rabies, which are found in dogs now. Scientists by the name of Homers is the first one that talked about rabies in dogs. And at the time, rabies in dogs, when they first talked about it, it was known as Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. Now it's known as rabies. We understand that more than anything. Polio is also caused by a virus. And of course, it leads to paralysis in the lower extremities. Polio may also be witnessed in drawings from ancient Egypt. Now, it was supposedly eradicated in 1979, but here we are in 2022, and just learned yesterday that there's a man in New York who has been diagnosed with polio. Smallpox has been surfacing in recent days, recent months as well. So those people who are not vaccinated against these diseases, against these viruses, will eventually begin to become infected because the virus is out there. It's looking. It is not dead. It is not going away. Now, we fight against it. We thought polio was gone. We think measles and the mumps have been eradicated, but every now and then it crops up because we let our guards down and we don't do what we need to do as humans to keep the fight going. So, talking about smallpox, which is a virus, now it was eradicated a while ago. However, sometimes, and I think in recent news, we hear about a case or two now and then, but as soon as we get them inoculated, well, and isolated, then they go away. Virology. So the study of viruses is called virology. Experiments on virology began in the experiments back in 1798 with a scientist by the name of Jenner. Now, Jenner did not know the cause, but he found that individuals exposed to cowpox did not suffer from smallpox. So he began his first known form of vaccination with cowpox. And he knew that if you inoculate people with the smallpox, cowpox, then they wouldn't catch the smallpox. So that's how they kind of fought it during those early days. So then there was Koch and Henle. Koch and Henle were scientists also that they founded the theories on the microbiology of diseases. So microbiology, biology is life. And so they focused on the microbiology of life, that microorganisms and life that are so small that you can't see with the naked eye. So their theories was that, number one, the organism must be regularly found in the lesions of the disease. So if he has a virus or disease, then the virus had to be in the lesions. Well, we know now that that's not always the case. Secondly, he postulated that it must be isolated from the diseased host and grown in a pure culture. And then thirdly, he hypothesized that inoculation of such a pure organism into a host should initiate the disease and should be recovered from the secondarily infected organism as well. Well, we know those were early theories and they didn't quite pan out to be as accurate as we now know how viruses work. Louis Pasteur, 1881 to 1885. Louis Pasteur was the first to use animals as models for growing and studying viruses. He found that the rabies virus could be cultured in rabbit brains, as a matter of fact, and he discovered that the rabies vaccine was one that he could develop and guard against the rabies that you find in dogs. He worked with the rabbits to develop the vaccine. So he did not identify the infectious agent during that time. He just knew that he could, if he found it in rabbits, in the rabbit's brain, he could take it and modify it and dilute it and then inject it into animals and people, and then they wouldn't have the rabies. The dogs wouldn't have the rabies. So in 1886 through 1903 is when the discovery of viruses, really took place, and they actually found viruses and they observed viruses and they were able to look at them. So a gentleman by the name of Bejurink demonstrated filterable characteristics of the virus and found that the virus is an obligate parasite. Okay, the virus is a parasite. This means that the virus is unable to live on its own. It has to have a host, and a host is the organism that the virus lives inside of, and then it can multiply and thrive. Now, some hosts are animals, lower animals, and a lot of viruses, as you look at history, existed in lower animals and at some point transferred over to humans. So the coronavirus has to have a human as its host. Because it is a parasite, it has to have a host to live within. Now, it eventually kills its host, which is ironic and strange, but that's how viruses work and some bacteria work. They live until they kill. So Charles Chamberlain and filterable agents. Okay, in 1884, the French microbiologist Charles Chamberlain invented a filter with pores smaller than bacteria. So Chamberlain's filtered candles of unglazed porcelain and made some diatomaceous earth, which is like a clay-like substance. You use that in swimming pools to filter the water. And so these filters retained the bacterium and had pores the size of 0.1-0.5 micron. Well, You don't know what that means necessarily. It's very, very tiny and small and you can't see it. But viruses were filtered through these and called filterable organisms at first. So then a person by the name of Leffler and Frosch, 1898, reported that the infectious agent that was of foot and mouth diseases was virus that was a filterable agent as well. And so in the 1900s, which is only recent, the first human disease shown to be caused by a filterable agent was yellow fever. Yellow fever. And that was discovered by Walter Reed. I believe it's the physician and scientist in which the Walter Reed Hospital in DC is named after. But he found that the yellow fever virus was present in the blood of patients during the fever phase. See, the early scientists thought that viruses had to be at the lesion site of people who were sick and diseased. But Walter Reed found that the disease, the virus, was present in the blood of the patients during the fever phase. And he found the yellow fever virus was spread through mosquitoes, though. Okay, so mosquitoes had the virus. Again, lower animals is where many of the viruses come from. And mosquitoes bite humans, and humans have the virus injected into their bloodstream, and then they develop yellow fever. And in 1853, there was an epidemic in New Orleans, and the rate of mortality from the infected was as high as 28%. Infectivity was controlled by destroying mosquito populations. That is the only way they stopped the yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans at that time. 1930s, Elford, another scientist, developed a collodion membrane that could trap the viruses and found that viruses had a size of 1 nanometer. Again, a very, very, very small size. And in 1908, Elmer and Bang demonstrated that certain types of tumors, leukemia of chicken, were caused by viruses. Now, we eat a lot of chicken today. Lots of chicken are eaten all over the world. Chicken is the only animal that doesn't live a natural life and die of natural causes. We eat them up within weeks and months of their lifetime, okay? So to be quite honest, I'm a little worried about all this chicken that we eat. Now, way back in the 1900s, early 1900s, there was leukemia of the chicken. And they finally discovered that leukemia and developed vaccine, and they wiped it out. And so we got healthy chicken today. But these viruses are dangerous. They're always trying to come back. They're always fighting to live. So 1911, Peyton Rouse discovered that non-cellular agents like viruses could spread in solid tumors. And this was termed the Rouse sarcoma virus. All right, then came the bacteriophages. The most important discovery was that the bacteriophage in 1915 by Twort was working on the vaccine of viruses and he found that viruses grew actually inside of bacteria. So viruses will grow wherever they get a chance to grow, wherever there's life and they can live, they will grow. This work by Twort was abandoned during World War I in 1917. And so it didn't get taken back up until later on by some others. But in 1931, there was a German engineer by the name of Ernst Ruska and Max Knoll. They found an electron microscope that enabled the first images of viruses. Before then, 1931, we couldn't see the virus. We didn't know what it looked like, but the micron microscope, the electron microscope, enabled us to see viruses for the first time. In 1935, the American biochemist and virologist Wendell Stanley examined the tobacco mosaic virus and found it to be mostly made of protein. A short time later, this virus was separated into protein and RNA parts. And then there was the tobacco mosaic virus, which was the first one to be crystallized and whose structure could therefore be elucidated in detail. So a lot of this is kind of boring, and I'll probably mention that again, and may seemingly unimportant, but we need to know that this virus thing is not something that just came along, and anybody can't just know a lot about it and tell you about it, because there's been a whole long history of centuries of studying by smart, intelligent people, more smart than many of us who are here today, and we must respect that. So between 1938 and 1970, virology developed by leaps and bounds. And in 1940 and 50s, this was called the era of the bacteriophages and the animal virus. A person by the name of Delbruck, considered the father of modern molecular biology, he developed the concept of virology in the sciences. And in 1952, Percy and Chase showed that it was the nucleic acid portion that was responsible for the infectivity and carried the genetic material. Nucleic acid. You may have heard about that in science in high school, but it is the nucleic acid portion that represents the infectivity part of the material. 1954, Watson and Crick found the exact structure of DNA. And in 1949, it was found that the virus could behave like bacteria genes, and it had chromosomes, and also found that the operon model for gene introduction was a repression. What else happened? There was only one type of nucleic acid that multiplied with their genetic material and was unable to undergo binary fission. In 1931, the pathologist Ernest Williams, he grew influenza and several other viruses in fertilized chicken eggs. So the flu virus that have been used for many, many, many years, and we get a flu shot every year, most of us, they developed those out of chicken eggs. So if you're allergic to chickens or chicken eggs, you couldn't even take the flu virus, the flu vaccine. In 1949, John Enders and Thomas Weller and Frederick Robbins, they grew polio virus in cultured human embryo cells. So they didn't have to grow them in chickens anymore. So that means more people could take advantage of the vaccine who were allergic to chickens. So this enabled Jonas Salk to make an effective polio vaccine. Now, Jonas Salk is probably the most famous scientist that you've heard associated with viruses and vaccines, because he was the one that invented the polio vaccine. He's also been famous for saying that every living creature has the right to live, and so does viruses. Just because we have a right to live doesn't mean that every other living creature doesn't have a right to live. Now, many of us humans got a problem with that, because there's a lot of killing going on amongst humans. We don't believe they have a right to live. Well, Dr. Salk believed, and trying to help you understand how this world works, is that every living being has a right to live, but you have to fight for it, okay? So the era of polio research was next and was very important. In 1953, vaccines were introduced, and by 1955, polio virus had been crystallized. And Sabin introduced attenuated polio vaccine. And so again, the polio disease was eradicated in 1979. And we should be rid of it, except those people who are not vaccinated or subject to become infected, like the gentleman in New York that I mentioned earlier. So in the 1980s, during the cloning of viral genes developed, sequencing of the viral genomes was successful and productive, and there became hydrodomus as a reality. The AIDS virus, HIV, came next in the 1980s. Further uses of viruses in gene therapy developed over the next 2 decades. The history is boring, as I've demonstrated, as I mentioned, and is uninteresting to most people. But it's very important to emphasize that viruses have been around for years and years and years. And there's been scientists that have dedicated their lives to developing weapons. Vaccines are the weapons that fight for humans. The vaccines fight for human existence. And they've been doing this over centuries and centuries. And it is astonishing to me how so many people who have not studied anything except maybe how to turn on a computer and gain access to the internet. Some people still can't do that. And they spread so many lies, so many misinformation that damages people and damages life. So many lies and misinformation about the coronavirus. Further, it is insane that so many people follow these crazy notions without any evidence of truth. The virus fights to live and will continue to fight to live by mutating and changing and creating itself, redeveloping itself to survive. And humans must do the same thing. We must keep changing the vaccines. We must keep changing our way of life. We must keep respecting the smart, intelligent people who are inventing the vaccines and telling us how to live in order to survive. We must do the safety steps. We must practice the safety behaviors. We must continue with our distancing if we aren't going to survive, because the viruses, they're working 24 hours a day and they're multitasking to continue to live. So who will win this battle? Well, so far, humans have pretty much kept up with the battle, fought it pretty good. But a lot of people have died. A lot of people have died. As I mentioned, at some point in one of these podcasts, that as many as 40 million people died worldwide from a virus, from a deadly virus, the Spanish flu. That was before we had vaccinations against the flu. And so that history is important for you to know, for us to talk about, research, study, understand, and then use that knowledge and information to go forward to keep us safe. So I would like to say to all of you, even though CDC has relaxed its changes, it has relaxed its rules, it has decided that we may no longer have to distance as far as we used to, or we may no longer have to use the mask all the time. The virus is still out there. Now, CDC and public health usually focuses on the broad picture and for the greater good of all mankind. But when you get down to the individual level, the poor people, people who are sick, the people who don't have good health care, the people who have predisposed conditions, we have to take care of ourselves. The senior citizens have to focus on what we and what they have to do to stay alive during this pandemic and this endemic, and while all these viruses are out here. So as we go back to school, the rules have changed, but we must continue to stay focused on the history and our health, because your history and your health comes first. That's all the time I have today. And so, as always, this is Dr. Brown, and I'll see you around. See you next time. Thank you.
This has been Your History and Health Comes First with Dr. Richard Brown. And you can leave suggestions at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.